a laundry list of ingredients on the package of a shake or a gel or a bar is often a warning sign, at least, and sometimes you need to go and do your research and find out what these things are that you're pouring into your body before you pour them into your body. And frankly, in many cases, you're going to discover that whole food options, whenever possible, should certainly be considered.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Total Labrada Gore. This is episode 47, and my guest today is Ben Greenfield. Ben is an ex-bodybuilder, Ironman triathlete, Spartan racer, coach, and speaker. He is also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Beyond Training, Mastering Endurance, Health, and Life. Ben was voted as NSCA's Personal Trainer of the Year, and in 2013 and 2014, he was named by Greatest as one of the top 100 most influential people in health and fitness. He's a blogger and a podcaster too. What doesn't he do? Clearly, he has lots to say about how to build our health and endurance through real food. You're going to love our conversation. Before we get into it, we want to recognize our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products offering fermented cod liver oil, concentrated butter oil, and coconut oil in a variety of products and blends. Visit greenpastureproducts.com. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. They've got so much going on. Check out their website on westonaprice.org and take advantage of their many free articles, videos, and resources. They are all about education, research, and activism for your health. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Ben.
Hey, thanks for having me on Wise Traditions.
Yeah, I'm super excited because I know a lot of our listeners want to be the best they can be. And dude, you are a bodybuilder and you've completed Ironman triathlons. You're a coach and speaker. Like, are you superhuman or what?
Ex-bodybuilder. I used to have much bigger shoulders and arms and quads than I do now. I think I look a little bit more normal now.
Well, what got you into all that?
Bodybuilding or just kind of like fitness geekery in general?
Fitness geekery in general.
Well, I grew up really not being very much into fitness. Like I kind of like any American boy, I guess, dabbled in soccer and baseball and basketball and, but more just to like get the t-shirt and go out for the free pizza afterwards. And really, I was more interested in online World of Warcraft and computer programming and fantasy novels. And I played violin for 13 years, and I was president of the chess club and was a consummate geek / nerd. And it wasn't until I started playing tennis in high school and really kind of like fell in love with the sport of tennis that I got a bit obsessed with how one could get the most out of the human body and brain, meaning training modalities and eating to fuel sport, even though I did it all freaking wrong back in the day. I was still interested in it. I was studying it. And I wound up getting so immersed in the science of sport that I went to university to study exercise science and biomechanics and exercise physiology. And I wound up even going on getting a master's degree and did a pre-med coursework and thought for a little while about going into medical school. And instead, after graduating from college, kind of stayed in the fitness and the nutrition sector. And I've worked for nearly 2 decades, both online and offline, as a speaker, as an author, as a coach, as a trainer, and have kind of just continued to take a deeper and deeper dive over the years into what makes the human body tick, especially in terms of how to squeeze every last drop of performance out of the body with I suppose most lately a focus on how to do that, but still maintain ancestral living components and still maintain a focus on longevity and still maintain a focus on fertility and health and all these things that I think athletes tend to neglect or to put far, far below the pedestal of performance. And when I say athletes, I don't just mean, some professional ironman triathlete or basketball player. Most of the people who I work with and advise and coach and give advice to, including myself, were just business people or, soccer moms or CEOs or, folks who are out there and working normal lives, but still wanting to tap into maybe like the pointier edges of exercise performance. Like they're out of couch potato mode, right? And now they want to maybe do a triathlon or a marathon or, jump into say like an obstacle course race, or do something that requires slightly more or slightly higher levels of fitness. So yeah, that's what I do. And that's how I kind of got interested in all this.
Well, I love that you are talking to everyday people too, because, some of us may aspire to be elite athletes, but most of us are just trying to get through day to day. But we do want to get the most out of our body, as you were saying, and the most out of our brain. So while you were spending all those years studying, we only have half an hour today, but I do want to pick your brain on some of the ways we can best fuel our bodies. And I'm intrigued by your phrase, ancestral health. So of course, that resonates with our listeners who are about the wise traditions. How can we fuel our bodies in a way where we're not kind of grabbing all those power bars and protein powders?
Yeah, you mean for sport during exercise?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have to, sadly, I have to ask that because there's so many people, who sit at their desk and are eating whatever the protein bar, for example, or the meal replacement shake, and doing so because it says healthy and because athletes do it. So it must be something you can eat at your desk. When in fact, in most cases, the packaged energy bars / gels / shakes on the market are designed to deliver a very, very high amount of calories in a very small package. It's one of the best ways to gain weight and to become as non-athletic as possible, to be fueling with any of those type of things apart from exercise. But then when we delve in and we look at fueling with, let's say, the average, power bar-esque type of bar or the average gel during exercise, what we find is that there are some components within those type of compounds that are not favorable for longevity or gut health or brain performance. So, for example, you'll find in many of these foods high amounts of fructose and maltodextrin. And fructose and maltodextrin, for a lot of people, can create a lot of gastric distress. They are highly fermentable. Maltodextrin tends to attract boatloads of water into the gut and can cause, diarrhea long term. They're void of fatty acids. They're void of amino acids. They're just basically fermentable sugars. And yes, sugar can be burnt as fuel during exercise, but I think that there are healthier ways to get it than the form of highly concentrated fructose and maltodextrin. And don't get me wrong. I mean, if you look at some of the best athletes in the world, they're eating, packages and bars and gels that are made up of those type of sugars, and they're still going fast. But these are also athletes who deal with things like acne and joint pain. And I don't even want to tell you the number of people who I get on the phone with, professional athletes from around the world who have a huge amount of gut problems, right? And not to be nasty here, but they they've got bloating and they've got gas all the time, and the bowel movements are highly irregular. And a big part of that is because of the highly concentrated forms of fermentable carbohydrates that are found in many of these sports compounds. Mm-hmm. And fructose and maltodextrin are two biggies, but there are plenty of others. And yes, it would include organic agave syrup and brown rice syrup and a lot of these quote healthier unquote sugar additives that are going into a lot of these compounds. So that's one of the issues is the high amounts of sugars. And then there are other things that you'll find in many of these packaged products, like caffeine, right? In many cases, greater than 4 cups of coffee squeezed into a tiny gel. Wow. And that's because, again, caffeine is an ergogenic aid, right? Like it can help with sports performance, but that doesn't mean that amount of caffeine does not fly in the face of, say, the health of, in this case, moving on from your gut, your central nervous system, right? So when you are requiring your central nervous system to churn out as much of a stimulus on the adrenal glands as that amount of caffeine requires it to do, you're producing a lot of hydrocortisone and cortisol. And in many cases, you're having to use cortisol precursors like pregnenolone, for example, in order to do that. And you're stripping your body of the building blocks that it needs for a lot of other downstream hormones like testosterone and DHEA and growth hormone, and some of these things that being in a constantly caffeinated cortisol hyped state can take a hit on. So, we look at some other things that you might find in some of these compounds, like preservatives, right? Additives. You look at, for example, one of the top Ironman triathletes on the face of the planet, Chris McCormick. I've read his book, and he talks about how he'd always have Ensure on hand, which is the physician recommended, liquid beverage that's just chock full of, the first few ingredients on it are like milk protein concentrate, canola oil, soy protein concentrate, corn oil, and then fructooligosaccharides, which are an extremely fermentable carbohydrate. And then, it kind of gets worse from there. But this idea of just like, frankenfuels in terms of some of the additives in some of these compounds is another issue. And, I certainly I don't just want to scare people, and I want to give you some alternatives. But one thing I should mention is that I do not necessarily endorse this idea of simply not eating something if you can't pronounce what's on the label, right? Because a lot of these things do have, they've got whatever cyanocobalamin or phyloquinone or, vitamin A palmitate or, these things that we might look at and say, oh, that's a frankenfuel, when in fact, those are the exact compounds we might find those particular things in their whole food form. But at the same time, a laundry list of ingredients on the package of a shake or a gel or a bar is often a warning sign, at least, and sometimes you need to go and do your research and find out what these things are that you're pouring into your body before you pour them into your body. And frankly, in many cases, you're going to discover that whole food options, whenever possible, should certainly be considered.
Right. And so it's really great to hear you elucidate about some of those kind of ingredients that we find that may actually be found in whole foods. So let's talk about that. What would you recommend as an alternative to some of these packaged foods?
Well, yeah, but before I jump into that, one thing to bear in mind here as I lay out some whole food alternatives is, let's say someone wants to do a triathlon. We certainly do get to a point where for you to carry like a potassium tablet is simply going to be more aerodynamically and weight favorable than you carrying a huge bunch of bananas, right? So there are some cases where using the packaged or the whatever you want to call it, the biohacked or the packaged or the sports performance version of a whole food sometimes does come in handy when you're in the middle of the race, right? And you just have to be as aerodynamic and light as possible. Right. But even in a situation like that, for example, I recently raced the Spartan Ultra Beast, which is the obstacle racing world championships. And that's 32 plus miles of obstacle course where you're dragging your butt up and down hills. And I don't want to carry a bunch of sweet potatoes and jerky and macadamia nuts in my pockets. They'd be falling out as I roll under the barbed wire and they'd be heavy. And so, in that case, I simply had a couple of water bottles, on a little sling around my waist. And all that was in those was a powdered coconut water with chia seeds and like a royal jelly extract and some stevia to give it some sweetness. Now, some people might consider that to be a frankenfuel, right? They're like, oh, you're just drinking whatever, powder out of a bottle. But in my opinion, is far different than the person who's, racing next to me and drinking, fructose-based Gatorade with chemical coloring in it, right? And so I think that you do need to look at some of this through the lens of, what is achievable for you to do in a sports performance scenario. So yes, if I would have had a young coconut with me, it probably would have been a young coconut and machete, I guess. It would have been better than powdered coconut water.
Right.
But at the same time, understand that there are some options out there when it comes to powders and gels and bars that are at least closer to a Whole Foods format. We could even delve into like the commercial bar world and look at something like a Lara bar, right? Yeah, you could have a Ziploc bag full of dates and fruits, and you'd have more water content and slightly more fiber than you might get in a Lara bar. But at least a Lara bar, for example, is a bunch of ingredients that, it's like dates and almonds, and usually there's a little bit of some extra fruit or some extra nut thrown in. But that's another example, of something that we could say is still packaged, is still marketed as a sports performance-based food, but is not going to, in my opinion, strip years off your life. The only thing we could say about that is, returning to what I mentioned earlier, it's a very concentrated source of calories you shouldn't be eating when you're sitting at your desk. But at the same time, during an event or during a race or during exercise or during a hard workout at the gym that's really long, it might be an option.
We want to pause now and thank our sponsors, Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products produces fermented cod liver oil and concentrated butter oil in a variety of flavors in liquid gel and capsule form. They also offer organic virgin coconut oil, virgin coconut ghee, and a complete oil blend that includes all of the nourishing oils. Lastly, they produce skincare balms and various byproducts that enrich the soil and feed of farm animals. Go to greenpastureproducts.com. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. The Wise Traditions Conference is less than 3 weeks away in Montgomery, Alabama. Ben will be there and so will I. We want you to join us. It's not too late to sign up. The foundation is offering a special rate. Everyone can register at the member rate now and use the code WAPF to get an additional $50 off. Altogether, it saves you $90 if you register now. Hope to see you in November.
Then we have the concept of real food.
Yeah.
And this is what I like. And this is kind of like 80% of my training is either in a fasted state or fueled by real food. So, for example, one of my favorites is to simply use macadamia nuts. Macadamia nuts are a perfect example of something that is higher in saturated fat, results in a high production of ketones when consumed. In that's because of the high amounts of saturated fat in it. And coconut oil and any coconut-based compound, a coconut manna, coconut flakes, coconut butter, any of these actually produce even higher amounts of ketones and are a very healthy, long-burning source of fuel. And by ketone production, what I mean is that the fats in some of these compounds tend to bypass digestion, go straight to the liver, and get converted into a readily metabolized form of fats called ketones, rather than having to go through the digestive process. So I'm a fan of fat-based compounds like that, macadamia nuts, coconut oil, and coconut derivatives. Like I mentioned, chia seeds, and making chia seed slurries by taking water and mixing about 9 parts water to 1 part chia seeds, and then adding things like stevia and sea salt and lemon juice. Doing like your own sports performance beverage based off of chia seeds is a really, really good idea, because chia seeds provide this slow, steady stream of fatty acids and amino acids. And both of those have different physiological benefits. For example, if we were to just eat macadamia nuts, say, which are slightly lower in amino acids than something like a macadamia or something like a chia seed, or we were to completely eschew protein during an event, what happens is that in many cases, people think that when you bonk or when you get really tired during exercise, it's because you've run out of glucose. That's often not the case. In many cases, we've got just enough muscle glycogen and storage liver glycogen on board to keep our glucose levels elevated enough during exercise. And in many cases, it's low levels of blood amino acids that result in tiredness. The actual reason for that is because once your blood amino acids drop to a certain level, it allows one particular amino acid called tryptophan, which you may have heard of as the one that makes you tired, after you've had a big turkey dinner on Thanksgiving, say. That one crosses the blood-brain barrier and results in a high amount of tiredness, when all the other amino acids tend to decrease. They aren't competing for tryptophan across that blood-brain barrier. You get tired, you're like, oh, I need sugar. And so, you have a Coke or whatever, or in many cases, I'll see athletes drinking like a Red Bull, when in fact, all you really need is like a little bit of protein from like a chia seed source or some other protein source, like say pemmican. I don't know if you've ever used pemmican before. It's just like a rendered tube of fat. And there are some companies, there are certainly recipes out there for it, but it's kind of like a Native American recipe. It's rendered fat, and a lot of times they'll add like cranberries and sea salt and a little bit of raw honey to it. And not only do my kids take this to school in their lunch boxes, but I'll use that like during a long bike ride. 1 stick of pemmican will keep you going for hours and hours and hours. And I mean, if you're throwing in some macadamia nuts and some chia seeds and a little bit of coconut oil And then you can of course use any variety of other seeds and nuts like almonds and cashews, and you throw in a little bit of fruit here and there. It's a cool scenario. When I say fruit, look at fig and look at dates when taken in moderation. And what I mean is that you don't want any explosive moments on the trail, so to speak, when you're out there, eating too much dried fruit, but small amounts of fruit mixed in with some of these compounds. I know I might sound like I'm being hypocritical here. Earlier I talked about fructans and fructose and how concentrated sources of that with maltodextrin that we find in a lot of these sports performance compounds can cause a lot of gut fermentation. But, a couple of dried figs per hour or a couple of dates per hour along with those macadamia nuts isn't anywhere near the level of fructose and fermentable carbohydrates as you'd be getting from, say, like a packaged gel eaten at the recommended dosage of 2 to 3 per hour, or like a bottle of Gatorade. And so throwing in a little bit of dried fruit here and there can be a good idea as well. So, those are some of the biggies. Obviously it's not rocket science, to find seeds and nuts and dried fruit and some chia seeds and some coconut derivatives, because coconut would be the medium chain triglyceride fat that's best burnt as energy during exercise. And to get all these together and to just have little Ziploc bags and little plastic wraps, and some people will even take aluminum foil, and I'll touch on that in just a moment, and to basically just have that stuff in a fuel belt or in the back of your jersey pocket if you're cycling, or in your gym bag when you're at the gym. And you'd be surprised at how much you can get away with. Now, I wanted to throw in 2 other quick things if I could.
Yeah, please.
The first is that there are even recipes out there, and there's a particular sports physiologist named Alan Lim, and he designs portable food recipes. I really like his books for like triathletes and mountain bikers and climbers and hikers. He's got one book called Feed Zone Portables, and he's actually worked with teams from the Tour de France where they will, prior to going out for their 6 or 7 hour bike rides, he's got recipes in there where you'll just like take a whole bunch of sushi rice, right, and you'll lay it out on a pan after it's been cooked. And then you'll take like bacon and eggs and salt, and you put that in the oven and you bake it for a little while. You take it out, you cut it into squares, and you put it in little aluminum foil packets that are about the size of a bar. So you've got like this bacon egg rice bar that is far healthier from a whole foods format and far lower in preservatives and additives, etc., and cheaper too, that you can just take with you on the fly. Or he'll have other recipes where instead of using like bacon and eggs and salt, the savory approach, you'll go with the sweet approach where you'll lay out the rice and everything, and maybe you'll add like some blueberries and some dark chocolate and wrap that in aluminum foil and have that as like your little, he calls them like rice balls and rice squares. And those are really cool little recipes that he has in that book. I'm a big fan of that one. And then another thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to just kind of like putting together this whole scenario of packing and bottles and aluminum foil and all that jazz is what I'll typically use are actual fuel belts. So rather than like stuffing things in pockets, there are a lot of companies like Nathan Sports, and there's even a company called Fuel Belt, and a whole bunch of others that will just sell these belts that have like little water bottles on them and little Ziploc bags and little pockets and places where you can put things. And it's pretty easy, even during something like an Ironman triathlon, to be able to carry real food in that type of form when necessary. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts as far as like some real food alternatives.
Well, it sounds fantastic. So tell me, I guess as you were learning all this, the fact that real food was better for fueling not just performance, but longevity and these other health issues, avoiding health issues. Before you got into all this, did you try it the other route? Like, have you experienced troubles yourself by eating kind of foods that would only fuel your performance but weren't beneficial to your body?
Like I mentioned at the beginning, with regards to bodybuilding, for example, when I started getting into that type of sport early on in the day, I kind of adopted like a low carbohydrate approach. Unfortunately, it was a low carbohydrate, very high protein, very low fat approach, which can be difficult on the body when it comes to producing a lot of the byproducts of excessive protein breakdown. There is even like there's a little bit of an aging effect of excess protein. It can increase the rate at which telomeres shorten by activating this protein called mTOR. There's a lot of issues with high protein, just as there can be a lot of issues with high carbohydrate. And so that combined with a very, very low fat intake left me with a little bit of andropause when I was a bodybuilder, meaning very, very low testosterone and very low DHEA due to not having enough fat on board, which is ironic because you know, people think you're like the ultimate male full of muscle and you have just no sex drive or libido or anything like that at all. And it's very common in the bodybuilding world. So yeah, I certainly had to deal with that. And that's where I learned my lesson about getting adequate fat and keeping the body's essential fat stores somewhat elevated. I also, for the first couple of years that I did triathlon, swallowed hook, line, and sinker this idea that the average endurance athlete should be eating 50 to 70% carbohydrate as their daily intake. And then on the week of a race, gradually do what's called carbohydrate loading by increasing carbohydrate percentages each day until the day before the race, you're up around, and this is typically the recommendation, 80 to 90% carbohydrate in terms of your total calorie intake. And the amount of fermentation and gut rot and blood sugar swings and the formation of free radicals and advanced glycation end products from excessive glucose in the bloodstream, a lot of bounce back from that type of thing. You know, I do a lot of blood and biomarker testing. You know, my fasted glucose would be above 100. My hemoglobin A1C, you know, close to 6. You know, that's like a 3-month snapshot of fasted blood sugar levels, really high levels of hsCRP and signs of vascular inflammation like homocysteine, and a lot of these issues that an athlete shouldn't have. And a lot of that is due to just like excessive carbohydrate intake. And so, you know, eventually after, you know, the years of experimentation and you know, learning about what does hurt the body and what doesn't, you know, I've mostly settled upon a relatively, I guess I would say, ancestral macronutrient percentage of around 50 to 60% fat, and 20 to 30% protein, and depending on the day's level of physical activity, anywhere from 10 to 30% carbohydrate. And that's even after, you know, and I've gone the other route too, right? I've gone full on ketosis, right? 80 to 90% fat and very low amounts of carbs and low amounts of protein. And there are issues with that approach too. You also, you know, with that strategy, because of inadequate carbohydrates, you don't have enough glucose to form like the proteoglycans necessary for joint health. You don't have enough glucose to convert, say, like inactive, you know, thyroid T4 into T3. So you tend to get like low thyroid, and you get cold easily, and you get joint pain. And so, yeah, you know, I've certainly guinea pigged a whole host of macronutrient percentages on myself for sport. And I have found that kind of that sweet spot is right around the 50 to 60 fat, 20 to 30% protein, and about 10 to 30% carbohydrate, with the higher percentage of that carbohydrate coming on the more active days.
But Ben, there's still people out there who are eating the other way that you described. In other words, they're still doing the carb loading and following those recommendations, right? Are those the people seeking you out for consultation because they're struggling?
You know, it kind of depends. I get a lot of folks who do have gut issues. Probably the two biggest issues that I get approached about by athletes are, yes, gut issues that often stem back to a high intake of bars and gels and shakes. And not just that, but also a lot of the other things that are shoved down athletes' throats these days, specifically like whole grains, beans, lentils, a lot of foods that, especially if not prepared and fermented and soaked and sprouted properly, can cause a lot of gut damage and gut distress. So that the other issue that I tend to see over and over again is adrenal fatigue and low amounts of hormones, andropause in males, amenorrhea in females. And in many cases, these are healthy athletes who are eating healthy and who are simply beating themselves up day after day with way too much exercise, inadequate calorie intake, and not enough focus on recovery methods such as meditation and yoga and adequate sleep and, you know, hot cold contrast therapy and all these things that athletes tend to neglect because they figure, you know, what the heck, I'm training hard and I'm eating relatively healthy food. And so gut issues and adrenal issues are two of the biggest problems that I tend to see athletes or very active people developing.
Oh my gosh, I'm taking notes because this is just fantastic, and I wish we had more time to talk. We're kind of getting to the end of the program, so I usually ask if a listener could only do one thing of what you have just discussed, if they could only do one thing to improve their health or get the most out of their bodies, what would you recommend that they do?
If you could do one thing, oh gosh, I mean, like there's so much. Here's what I would say. There's this concept that Nassim Taleb talks about in his book Anti-Fragile, how, you know, there's this hormetic effect, right? Like little things that would be bad for you in high amounts, like, sun and radiation and cold and heat are actually good for you in low amounts. They're like these daily stressors that occur in low amounts. So I'm a big fan of doing something every day that has that hormetic effect on your body. That could be eating a large variety of wild plants, which actually are bitter and toxic and poisonous, but those small amounts of bitterness and toxins and poisons are actually good for you. They amp up your body's own natural production of antioxidants. Or say taking a very cold shower for 5 minutes. And so you're getting that nitric oxide release and that stress resilience that cold might give you. Or maybe doing the opposite and going to the sauna for like 30 minutes and sweating really hard and producing a lot of heat shock proteins and making your central nervous system stronger. Or doing something like going out between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. and getting a good 20 to 30 minutes of UVA and UVB radiation from the sun. Mm-hmm. So I think that every day you should do something that causes a small amount of damage to your body, results in a tiny amount of you being uncomfortable. And yes, exercise is a hormetic stressor. Absence of food or fasting is a hormetic stressor. There are all sorts of things you can do. But that's what I would say is do something every day that is a mild stress to your body.
Wow, that's excellent. And actually, they all have a little bit of appeal. I especially like the sunshine one. But I really appreciate your time today, Ben, and I think people are going to walk away with some ideas on how they can get the most out of their bodies and their health. So thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And I'll see you at the conference.
That's right. I'll be there.
My guest today was Ben Greenfield. Learn more about what he's up to by going to his website, bengreenfieldfitness.com. Check out his books, his blog, and his podcast. And you can also find a list of resources and highlights from this conversation on the westinaprice.org website. Click on the word podcast and go to the show notes for episode 47. Hey, and a huge thank you to my team at Podcast Village for your editing and production assistance, and for lending me your studio space. We appreciate you so much.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with others. Post a link on Facebook or Twitter, or send a link to a friend in an email, or simply review Wise Traditions on iTunes. Sharing the podcast is one way to spread the important message of health through nutrition. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.